written in 2008. And at the time, Charlotte used the word messy. That was a very messy year. And my relationship with my mother was messy. It wasn't bad, it wasn't good. It was just kind of messy. When I wrote this, it was a friend of mine was putting together a book of short stories about our friendship, about her growing up in Arizona, and asked me to contribute. She wrote a story about my mother's funeral and asked me to do the same. At the time I wrote this, I really didn't realize till today that this would be my testimony. It was a messy year, but God did use it for my good and for my mother's good. And it's called Bluetooth and Blood Clots. As I sat in my car in front of my mother's house, I waited, reluctant to go in. This was my mental preparation before a visit with my mother and stepfather Norman. I would start with a prayer, asking that they would not be home. I would call later and regretfully say that I had just missed them. I was then safe for another couple of weeks before my next obligatory visit. Now things were different. Norman was still narrow-minded, very opinionated, and difficult to be around. But Mom was losing her battle with Alzheimer's and was becoming a danger to herself and to Norman. Nevertheless, I waited and prayed. When it was time to go in, I lifted my lifeless right arm off the console that it was resting on and tightened my sling. I was technically not yet allowed to drive after my surgery, but the circumstances outweighed the risk. Norman had become ill and needed to be hospitalized, and Mom needed constant care. As I carried my arm up the driveway, I was greeted by a concerned neighbor who had news about my mother. As the neighbor spoke, my heart sank. Mom had wandered out of the house while Norman was in the shower and managed to outrun all of the neighbors. Sorry. They had no choice but to call the police, and they were able to bring her home safely. My mother was English, always proper, always wore a dress, and her home was always spotless. She was never comfortable relaxing or hanging out. There was always somewhere else to go and something else to do. That was the only familiar trait that remained. Wherever she was, she needed to be somewhere else. And that somewhere else was home. The problem was, we didn't know what home she was referring to. On this hot Arizona spring day, she searched for her home, wearing a gray wool jacket and matching skirt, leaving her teeth behind. I had never witnessed my mother toothless, and as I walked in, ready to scold her and Norman, it was difficult not to smile. Mom was extremely proud of her outing and a bit smitten with the handsome police officer who brought her home. I glanced at Norman, slouched in the living room chair, and then at Mom. Mom, I asked, where are your teeth? Well, I don't know, she replied. Where are you going, I asked. Well, I don't know, she replied. I did my best to explain to her that she could not leave like that anymore, and told her lightheartedly that I had never been brought home by a police officer. She gave me an unforgettable, toothless smile and replied, oh, but he was nice. I could no longer contain my laughter, and Mom laughed right along with me. Norman was not amused. Oh, darling, what have you done with your arm? Asked my mother. After the first few times of explaining to her that I had surgery because of blood clots in my arm, I knew that repeating again would be pointless. She would forget her question before I finished the explanation. I simply said I had an operation. And that seemed to satisfy her until she would ask again a few minutes later. It was painfully obvious that Mom could not be left alone while Norman was in the hospital, and that they would both need help after surgery. My prayers were now simply to be a better daughter. The next few weeks, Mom's care was divided between me and my two brothers. Since my surgery, I worked from home, and she was left in my care during the day. Between my useless arm and trying to keep my mother from escaping, work was put on the back burner. Care for my mother was challenging. I thought that getting her to bathe and eat were the most difficult tasks I had encountered, until I had to take her to adult daycare while I went to physical therapy. I was constantly reminded of the challenges of caring for a toddler when my mother was in my care, but leaving her at daycare was as heart-wrenching as leaving your child. My time at physical therapy was the next best thing to heaven. I had adult conversation, I laughed and had my arm massaged and challenged. It was the only time I didn't feel the pain and discomfort of a semi-useless limb, and I was able to collect my thoughts and pray for strength for another day. As I entered the senior center to pick up Mom after another therapy session, I was greeted at the door by one of the caregivers with the same look as a concerned neighbor who she was previously able to outrun. "Your mother hit one of the caregivers," she informed me. My heart sank. Physical therapy was my safe haven, my escape. I could not give that up. But the caregiver was very sympathetic and assured me that it would get better. As I buckled Mom's seatbelt, she looked up at me, smiled, and told me how nice those people were today. Driving with one hand did not allow the luxury of talking on a cell phone, so the use of a Bluetooth device was a necessity. Before I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone rang. It was my husband Ron calling to check on me. "Hello," I answered. "Hello," replied Ron, and "hello," replied my mother. She sat next to me looking out of the window. "No," I replied as I attempted to lift my right arm to point to the device attached to my ear and explain that I was talking on the phone, not to her. "Where are you now?" I asked my husband. "Phoenix," he replied. "Well, I don't know," said my mother. As she looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings. I knew that explaining to her what a Bluetooth was would be as useless as explaining my surgery. So my two-way conversation continued. Ron would be home at 6, and Mom wasn't sure when she'd be home. When I said goodbye and I love you to my husband, Mom replied with a heartfelt, "I love you too." The next few weeks were challenging for my brothers, my husband, and for me. It must have been hell for my mother. Her soulmate had vanished, and she was shipped back and forth between her children, who she did not know, yet somehow trusted. Sleeping, bathing, and eating were a battle, and after numerous sleepless nights, we all knew that she would never go home. When Norman returned from the hospital, we found an assisted living facility for both of them. When Norman was forced to return to the hospital, we were happy that Mom would have around-the-clock care. I would visit every day and was always greeted with a grateful and sometimes tearful hello. The only food that she would willingly eat was a hamburger and milkshake, and that's where we had it every day. On one afternoon, I watched as she was continuously petting a stuffed animal. "Would you like to bring your friend along?" I asked. She looked at me, smiled, and touched the tip of her nose with my finger and said, "I have a friend, and it's you." For the first time in my life, I felt the same way. Mom could somehow sense when it was time for me to leave before I would pick up my purse. She would hold on to my arm for dear life as if I would disappear. In her mind, we all eventually disappeared. Norman's second visit to the hospital was more than Mom could handle. A part of her was missing, but she had no idea what it was. My daughters Sarah and Katie came with me and my mother to the hospital to see Norman. She did not recognize her husband of 45 years, and minutes after we arrived, she grabbed Katie's arm and said, "Let's get out of here." That would be the last time that Mom and Norman would see each other. On the way home from the hospital, we made our usual trip to McDonald's for a hamburger and milkshake. I unwrapped the burger for Mom and handed it to her. She held it with uncertainty and asked me what it was. I encouraged her to take a bite, and she looked at me with a look of confusion and fear that I recognized all too well. She didn't know how to take a bite anymore. She no longer knew how to swallow. I knew that day she couldn't survive much longer. Mom passed away a few weeks later with all of her children by her side. With her final breath, she was more peaceful and beautiful than we had ever seen her. I have since regained use of my right arm and can't help to think that somehow my useless arm was the answer to my prayers. It allowed me to take care of my mother and to become, for a short time, the daughter that I had prayed to be.